You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And today's conversation will focus on the U.S. federal budget and our rapidly growing debt levels. Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, who is the president of the Committee for Economic Development, the Public Policy Center of the Conference Board. Lori, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
So, Lori, you're sitting in Washington. You know, I spent a little time in Washington. Even those of us who kind of understand it, it's a little mysterious down there what they're doing with this federal budget. But can you just describe a little bit about what the process is and where are we with it?
Okay, Steve, I'm going to tell you what the federal budget process is, but in full transparency, we haven't followed this process in almost 30 years, but there is a process. The president is supposed to write his budget and submit it to Congress. He usually does that by February of the new year. He includes both spending for government agencies, yearly spending, education, research. Those are yearly budgets. But he also includes mandatory spending. Those are the entitlements, and that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and that's about 50% of the budget. And so this goes to the Congress. The Budget Committee set a budget resolution that tells Congress what the level is that they should be spending. It goes to the appropriation committees. They set out their bills. And after these bills are passed, you have a budget process. Well, that's not quite what has happened over the past 30 years. And this year is a particularly special year where we are using the special process called reconciliation, which is really an omnibus budget bill. Everything is in one bill, and it's under special rules. You only need 50 votes in the Senate to get it through.
So if it's required every year that this process be followed, and it is required by law, how can the president and the Congress get away with not following the process?
Well, I think that's because there's no real enforcer except themselves. So the president this year, the president and the administration said, well, they were new, they didn't have access to information during the transition process, and they sent up their budget very late in May. And then Congress did its thing and started working on its side of it. But this takes a lot of negotiations, and this is a particularly tricky year because there's no Republican support for this bill. They are using the reconciliation process, but you're watching this process unfold with the Democratic Party negotiating among themselves, and they do have very, very different factions across the spectrum on the approach to this. So they basically are their own enforcers and follow their own process.
So they kind of do what they want, even though there is a process that they've outlined and said this is the law. But we'll follow it when we feel like it. I guess is the way to think about it. You know, the federal budget, rule of thumb, has always been it's about a $4 trillion budget, and there's $3 trillion that comes in revenue. So we run about $1 trillion deficit, and that adds up over time. Okay, so that's been kind of where it's been at. But what is the level of the budget today, and the deficit levels?
Okay, so the president's budget was actually $6 trillion, and it raised about $4 trillion in revenue. What's come out of the budget committees, the budget resolution is a $3.5 trillion bill that has about $2.1 trillion in revenue. But you also have the add-on because the infrastructure piece of the budget, this year's budget, was pulled out for bipartisan work and eventually bipartisan agreement, and that's a $1.2 trillion bill.
So the president, the administration proposed a budget that was roughly 50% higher than normal, and of course, then the deficit was quite a bit higher than normal too. So that's that's a lot of money when just between us friends.
Yeah, and look at where we've come from. In 2019, the deficit had been running about $1 trillion, as you said. But in 2020, because of the pandemic, the deficit went up to $3.1 trillion because of the emergency programs that we
in one year. That's 1 year's deficit, right?
$1 trillion to $3.1 trillion in 1 year.
Wow.
Because of the pandemic. And the debt has gone up. We have a national debt of $28 trillion. That's over 100%. That's 101% of our gross domestic product. We've gone over 100% of our GDP.
Well, I remember at the end of the Bush administration, Bush 2, that Bush 43, as they refer to him, the total level of debt hit $9 trillion, and that is, and then the Obama administration said that was outrageous, and $9 trillion, and we needed to cut that. But at the end of the Obama administration, it was $20 trillion. So they more than doubled the level of debt. And then at the end of the Trump administration, it was up by a few more trillion. But you're saying now it's over $28 trillion. So they keep talking about the debt and these debt levels being bad, and they keep criticizing their predecessors, but they keep running it up.
Right, exactly, and it's concern about the deficit seems to be where you sit is where you stand, and so it keeps shifting back and forth. Who's concerned about the deficit? So the good news is debt and deficit stays part of the debate. The bad news is that no one is acting on it. And this has only been made worse by the fact that the pandemic debt has desensitized everyone to trillions. We had the $2 trillion bill, then we had the $1.9 trillion bill, and in order to deal with the pandemic debt. And there's another major phenomenon that's happening that hasn't really gotten as much attention as it should, because the pandemic debt has actually superseded any other discussion. But over the past several years, there has been a movement towards what's called modern monetary theory. And that basically says, so long as you're a country that can print money and your currency, you can print money for your currency, that you really don't have to worry about paying for your debt, because you can print your money to pay for it. There's a simplistic way of putting it, but that's modern monetary theory. And it was really the basis for the Bernie Sanders campaign. And why is that significant? Because Bernie Sanders is actually chair of the Budget Committee right now.
Wow. So, that reminds me of modern math, when we were kids, Lori, when nobody understood what they were talking about, and math should be math. And it seems to me that, budgets should be budgets. And I just don't understand. I mean, we in our households, we're expected not to spend more than we take in. I mean, that you can't spend more than you have. I mean, that's just, the ABCs of life. But it doesn't seem to work with the government. They don't seem to care how much they spend.
Well, and it's interesting, Steve. As you know, this year we're honoring with our CED Distinguished Leadership Awards Brian Moynihan from Bank of America. And he was actually asked in one of our discussions with him leading up to the awards what he thought about modern monetary theory. And his answer was very similar to yours. He said, you could talk economics all you want. The only economics that has always been important to me and this is what should be important to all Americans is home economics, because that's where you learn that you have to balance your budgets and you have to balance your checkbook.
Yeah, and obviously the people accountable for our collective checkbook don't follow the same rules. Well, as you think about the federal budget, I mean, there's some really, really big line items on there, and I know that a lot has been made about the cost of our overseas ventures over time, but the top budget item is Medicare and Medicaid, which totals about $1.3 trillion, and then you have Social Security, which is $1.1 trillion. So almost half of the budget is due to these social entitlements, is how they're labeled. Then you go way down from that to defense, which is $700,000, and then to $400,000, and then there's sort of everything else that they do. So, it seems to me when you're thinking about because you've always got this conundrum. How do you balance the budget? Well, you have to either raise taxes or cut spending. But if you look at the spending, you can't cut defense. I mean, you can cut a little bit, but you could cut it all out and you wouldn't. You would still have a deficit. So, but you do need to defend the country. So it really comes back to dealing with entitlements, and CED has written a lot about this.
Right. And I do want to add one more thing that you didn't mention about what is built into the budgets, which is actually the interest on the debt, which right now is about 8% of the budget, but we're at very, very low interest rates. So I just want to make sure that our listeners know that that is a built-in cost, and that is one of the big concerns, that when interest rates start going up, can we afford to pay the interest on the debt? But as you were saying, in terms of Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, we really need to, particularly Medicare and Medicaid and the price of healthcare, that is astronomically rising. Our population is aging. And so when we're looking at what new programs and what new entitlements, and I'd like to pause right here and just emphasize that while the president's budget at $6 trillion was a very large budget, at $3.5 trillion plus the $1 trillion for infrastructure is a very large budget, particularly after spending so much money, about $6 trillion on the pandemic response. It is more than significant because of the money. It's actually a transformational budget. It is really adding, changing, expanding programs on the spending side in terms of entitlements that we haven't seen since President Roosevelt and the New Deal. And even the New Deal was a series of bills that were passed. And the same thing with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. This is all happening in one budget bill that's going to be an omnibus bill that's going to be voted on, and if it passes, by one party.
Yeah, one of the issues is that there's the ongoing effects of it. It's not like the spending for the pandemic, which were, these were clearly large numbers. You mentioned $6 trillion, but that's a one-time expense in the sense that, it doesn't happen every year. But when you put in, you're calling it a transformational budget, but what you're saying is there are transformational programs, and this spending becomes permanent. I mean, we never roll back any of these programs. We might nip and tuck here and there, but we never roll them back. So therefore, this adds an ongoing layer that is of expense that's from here to eternity that is 50% higher than what we've been spending.
Exactly. And if you look just simply at the tax credits for the child tax credit, you look at that, just one program, $100 billion a year. That's just it being extended for 5 years. But it was supposed to be a one-time during the pandemic. Now it's being extended for 5 years. And what will happen after that 5-year period? And actually, there's a push among progressive Democrats on the Hill to make that permanent. And the president put in a 5-year limit. But nonetheless, you're adding more and more entitlements into paid family leave, the universal pre-K. These are costs that won't go away, and they just add to what you have to fund every year.
Yeah, and we're a compassionate society. I mean, we don't want people sleeping on the streets. We don't want our elderly people to go without care. So, we want this for our people, but at some point it comes back to, can we afford all of this? And so what happens to these deficits? I mean, so you got so much money coming in, but the money going out well exceeds that. And so how do we make that up?
Well, and that's just getting back to your point about what CED has been looking at and actually been recommending for years. You really have to look at these entitled programs. You have to look at Medicaid and Medicare, and particularly Medicare, and how are we spending that money? How do we get cost competitiveness built into those programs so that you could get quality programs at lower prices? Looking at Social Security and what's happening on the Hill with the leadership on the Hill is that they're talking about lowering the age that you can get Social Security, and we should be looking at raising the age that you should get Social Security. Both those trust funds are going broke. One in 2026 and one in 2033. And we have to look at that and take it seriously. We can solve these problems. We know what the problems are. We've got some really credible voices on the Hill saying, one, let's look at the 3.5. Is that really what we need? You have the same type of approach taken when you actually work in a bipartisan way and you take into consideration the concerns and interests of a broader group. You actually are getting closer to where responsible policy should be for the nation. And in fact, there was just a poll in May done by Ipsos that actually says the American public is very concerned about the level of deficit spending and the
Right.
amount of debt we are accumulating. So this is not outside of our political leaders' realm of pressure and concern among the American public.
Right. We're talking with Dr. Lori Esposito Murray about debt and deficits. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more of the conversation.
Hi, I'm Eric Schwartzman, author of The Digital Pivot: Secrets of Online Marketing, the first non-technical book for the general business reader that simplifies the process of digital marketing. If you're in marketing, public relations, corporate communications, or promotions, The Digital Pivot explains in simple, jargon-free language exactly what it takes to build an audience and convert sales online. And it also explains your department's role in the digital business landscape. So if you want a digital marketing MBA in a single book with plenty of interesting stories from my 20-year career in digital marketing consulting with Boeing, Toyota, and the U.S. Department of Defense, go to digitalpivotbook.com and order a copy. You can also get an audiobook read by me. And if you're looking for a dynamic speaker to keynote your next event or talk to your group about pivoting to digital marketing, check out my 2021 speaker reel at ericschwartzman.com.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined by the president of the Committee for Economic Development, the Policy Center of the Conference Board, and its president, Dr. Lori Esposito Murray. So, Lori, we've been talking about debt, the deficit. Talk about, a lot of people say, well, the economy is growing, so, you can add debt relative to the size of the economy, and it's okay. And that's called the so-called debt to GDP levels. How does our current level compare to historical levels?
Well, we're getting very close to the historical level of 1946, right after the World War. And that was at 106% of debt to GDP, and we are getting very close to that limit, and we'll be there soon. We're now at 101%. It's expected to be there within 10 years. What's critical here, though, is to recognize that we grew out of that debt after World War II. But every time we've had to deal with a large, massive amount of debt in U.S. history, it has always been after a war. These are peacetime debt accumulation. And this is the first time that we are approaching the limits of 1946, but we're also approaching the limits of 1946 in a peacetime economy.
Well, and you have to point out that the post-World War II average has been 40% debt to GDP. So we're 2.5 times that in a peacetime environment, meaning we're spending all of this just on our own without any kind of war or world crisis driving it. I mean, the pandemic is one thing, but as you said, the things that are driving it going forward are these commitments to new entitlement programs, all of which, of course, you think about them and they all sound great, but it comes back to how you're going to pay for it. So where, based on these projections, where does debt to GDP go in the future, and then what?
Well, the CBO projects that within 30 years, we're going to be about 146%, 150% of debt to GDP, and these are really concerning numbers because how do you pay for it? How can you grow out of it? When does it become really significant? And it's not just the spending side; it's the spending and the revenue side as well. You just need rational policies, thoughtful, rational policies where you're looking at what are the real needs, what programs are working, what programs aren't working, especially since we've just spent trillions of dollars on many programs, and the economy is coming back. And I actually think first and foremost, what we should be doing is getting people back into jobs, and that's where you can expand again your tax base. Get people back into jobs, get them working, get them trained, get them into higher paying jobs, skilled jobs. They're there. That's where the economy is heading, and that's where we should be spending our resources to get people back to work in order to expand the tax base. And of course, there's having a fairer tax system.
Yeah, but that point that you just made is really important because we have about 333 million people in this country right now. We have in the workforce only about 153 million people, or less than half of the people. Now, some of the population is too young, they're children or they're retired. So that makes there's some sense. But this is a really low labor participation rate. And then the number of taxpayers out of that 333 million is only 125 million. So there's an imbalance here. So getting people back to work and not consuming tax money, but in fact contributing is an important concept here.
Yeah, and then you can assess what are the needs. Once people are working, your SNAP programs, your food programs, the needs are probably, we were in an extreme crisis, and you want to move out of that crisis. You want to get the economy going. You want to get people back to work, and then your needs assessments will be different. They will be different because people will be working, and and as opposed to putting in more and more entitlements, we ought to be dealing with this, looking much more agilely at an economy that get the economy working and assess needs as you go along.
But at least one president recently, and of course many in Congress say debt doesn't matter. Is that true?
Debt matters. And that's one of the most important things that we have to recognize as a nation if we're going to move forward, and as policy leaders and as leaders in this country, that debt matters. And it matters because the IMF just did a study where they showed that, in fact, when you have a financial crisis, it really does come on very quickly, and it's really hard to predict. Looking at all the financial crises, across time and around the globe, and so you have to be, you should be prepared for this. But so debt matters because it decreases confidence. It puts you on shaky ground. It increases inflation. It slows growth. It matters.
Yeah. And people say, well, even though that we're approaching, the Greece levels of debt, it's not the same in the U.S. because the dollar is the reserve currency, but it's only the reserve currency because it's been a safe place. It doesn't mean that there's some, there's some anointment here that it forever will stay the same. So, essentially, if this keeps going, what will, I can't see that it ends well. I mean, it usually ends in hyperinflation, dollar devaluation, currency devaluation, and ultimately the standard of living just drops. I mean, you've seen this in every case around the world over time. So why can't our politicians learn from other people's history? Why are they intent on continuing down this path?
I think and you see this in business as well. And one of the issues that plagues business, it's short-termism versus long-termism. Get what you want now, do what you think is popular, don't make the tough decisions. you have a process that unfortunately, because of that is dysfunctional in terms of a political process, in terms of the parties working together. And what's so encouraging about this year, and that's why it's so important that this infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, does pass, and we're seeing the controversy develop over that because of the lack of agreement among the Democrats on the reconciliation budget bill. That both sides came together and they came up with, to your point about what numbers are right, where should we be? They came up with an infrastructure bill that Republicans and Democrats supported. And it's a reasonable, rational approach that deals with the fact that we haven't been improving infrastructure for years. We're desperate for that improvement, and it's going to help our economy grow. And that's an encouraging sign that we can work together. The leaders are there who could do it. It's really a matter of will.
Yeah, and if you spend on infrastructure, it facilitates GDP growth, which then helps us grow out of it. So it isn't truly an investment that will pay out, whereas some of these other things don't necessarily lead us to that way. Okay, so we've got to deal with this situation. What do we do? You got a lot of politicians that say, tax the rich. What do you say?
Well, you've got to look at both sides. You've got to look at spending and you've got to look at taxes. And both of those have to be rational, and particularly on the tax side, you've got to be fair. And if you cut taxes too low, you lose revenue, you hurt growth, and you also encourage tax. If taxes go too high, you have tax avoidance, you hurt growth. If they go too low, you lose revenue. And so, the point here is you want to broaden your tax base. As I said, you want to get your people back. You want to get the American people back to work, and you want them in good jobs. But you also want to tax money the same way, across the board. You basically want to have a fair tax system and avoid these loopholes, or a way to avoid taxes, and have tax rates across the board on wealth.
Yeah, but they keep using this term fair share. People need to pay their fair share, but then you read that less than half of the population, or about half the population, doesn't pay federal taxes legally. I mean, that's the way it's structured, and the top 1% pays 40% of all taxes. So, how do you define fair share?
It's you pay what you're aiming for is different forms of income pay the same tax. That's really what you're looking for.
That's what you're talking about. So you're saying that people who make a salary should be taxed the same way that people who make their earnings off of, a trust fund that they've earned, or carried interest, or, other means of building wealth. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, last thing to sum up, what should we do differently? So what's the message to the president and to the Congress?
Okay. First and foremost, we've got to slow the growth of debt. When I say reducing spending, it's by looking at these new programs that we're doing and figuring out what's needed and what can we pay for. But even if the problem here is that we are carrying this huge amount of debt, so that's why we have to first look at the growth of debt and look at your spending with that in mind. And as I said, there is this center of gravity now in the Senate and in the House where that is how they are actually looking at what should this overall level of the bill be, but whether it's the reconciliation bill or the infrastructure bill. And that's been criticized, don't come up with a high number, but the high number is important when you're looking in terms of the budget in general. And then what you want to do too is you need to look at the fastest growth in spending programs. And that's where you've got to look at healthcare, and you've got to deal with the growth of healthcare. And that's only going to get worse as the population gets older. And, how do you get a competitive system built into our healthcare, our Medicare, so that we're actually dealing with prices that are competitive. And as I said, be judicious about the new programs that we're creating, about what's really needed. And on the tax side, just getting back to that, creating an efficient and fair tax system and eliminating tax breaks.
Yeah, sounds very sensible. Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, thank you so much for joining us today and making some sense out of this.
Well, thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from one of our centers or other business executives from our member companies to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing and communications, the economy, and human capital. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues. I know that they're going to want to listen to it. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.